Just a reminder that this is the second session with feeding ewes and rations for UK Lambing School. Tell you again, welcome from the Kentucky Sheep and Goat Development Office and the Kentucky Sheep and Wool Producers. We're happy to be able to help Dr. Ely get his lambing school online this year and get it all together. So if you're not familiar with us, here's my email and here's our web address. Come check us out.
This is feeding and management of ewes in late gestation, parturition, or lambing in the first 60 days of lactation. And we'll do a little bit of management. I think we did a little last week. I thought it was a little bit, but so most of it will be on feeding. And I think this is so important in a sheep operation, obviously. And we're going to discuss feeding in late gestation, parturition, and early lactation being the first 60 days under 3 management or lambing seasons, January, February, and April, September, and October. I guess, and I would know that there's people listening that would lamb in any of those 3. So feeding and management might be a little different from one to the other. Yes, it is. But I've tried to make this as generic as I can so that the concepts and the principles would hopefully apply across these lambing seasons. So here's one of those slides. It's got a lot of stuff on it. It's going to take me a little while to talk about this. When we talk about these 3 management periods, I don't have a third one in here. I don't have parturition in here, but you look down here, late gestation and early lactation. They're the 2 big ones that we're going to talk about. I'd stick parturition or lambing in between those, and I'll talk some about that. So based on that, let's go back to the top and look. We think that success in late gestation, parturition, and lactation is a function to a great extent of the body condition scores of the ewes. We know that the body condition scoring range for ewes ranges from 1 to 5. 1 is, as I describe her, as a skinny mini. She's healthy, but she is really skinny. And of course, a 5 is roly-poly. So these ewes at different times during the year, an annual production year, need to vary in their body condition score according to the numbers that are shown on this slide. Look at late gestation. It's got 1 asterisk on it. We're expecting twins always. 2 asterisk is early lactation, first 60 days. And then the 3 asterisks at weaning time is 60 days after lambing. So basically, the ewe is going to nurse twins for 60 days, and we're going to wean the lambs at that time. I fully understand that not everybody's going to do that. So you have to adjust your situation based on the foundation that I'm using here. Now we can go back to the top. When you see the stage of production, she's dry and open. That is basically she's at maintenance during that time. She's not nursing any lambs and she's not pregnant. This is important too. That's when determine what weight our ewes are. And I'm going to use all through this presentation 150-pound ewe when she's dry and open. When she's at maintenance, she's loafing, okay? She weighs 150, 154 pounds, whatever. NRC, National Research Council, says 154 pounds. I don't know where they got that, but we'll round it off to 150. Okay, so she's dry and open a lot of the time during the year. She becomes dry when we wean the lambs down here at the bottom. So that is basically the beginning. When she enters dry and open is at weaning time, basically. That's 1.5 to 2 in both of those. Now, that's fine, okay? She's really milked good all through the lactation, and we fed her really good, and she produced 2 scrapping lambs, and her body condition is still going down to 1.5, 2. The problem comes in then she's going to leave dry and open and go to flushing breeding at the same body condition score. How many of your ewes gain a lot of weight from the time they wean lambs until they're ready to breed again or go into gestation or even parturition? When the grass is good, that's when they're going to gain a lot of weight, especially when they're loafing, as they are when they're dry and open. So it behooves us to try to keep them at a 1.5 to 2 body condition score all through that dry and open or maintenance period. And that might be 100 days. So you got to work at it a little bit, but boy, that's the time to save a little money, as far as I'm concerned. So let's say we do that, and she's 1.5 to 2 when we begin to nutritionally flush her and breed her. This is nutritionally flushing, okay? So she's on a 1.5, and so that nutritional flushing is 2 weeks. And then we continue to feed her so that she gains some weight during that breeding season. And then she'll go out of the breeding season, she'll be pregnant, and she'll be a 2 to a 2.5. That's the same as going into early gestation. Early gestation is another 100 days, 110 or something like this, depending. So 100 days. And that ewe, please listen, she should gain about 7 to 10 pounds in that 100 days. If she gains 20 or 25 or 30, she's going to be overfed. Try to keep her at that 2 to 2.5, so her body conditions go up to a 3. Yes, she'll gain some weight. Yes, it'll go up to a 3. And you can use low quality feed during this early gestation. That's when you can really feed low quality stuff. So now she's a 3 and she goes into late gestation. Late gestation is the last 28 days of pregnancy. Look what happens to her body condition score in 28 days versus what it did, the way it changed in early gestation of 100 days. It went up a half or thereabouts because we socked the feed to her. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. Then she lambs at 3.5 to 4, and that's when she begins early lactation. She's in good shape, we'd say. But then we feed her and feed her and feed her till her eyeballs pop out, and she still loses weight during that lactation period, so that she's 1.5 to 2. Then we're going to wean the lambs off of her at 60 days at 1.5 to 2. Then she goes dry and open and turns this system around and around. How much your ewes weigh? You may need to purchase a set of scales if you can't estimate their weight when they're dry and open, because we feed according to weight in so much of this. So the key, I think one of the main keys anyway, maybe not the only, but one of the main keys is to have the ewes in the right body conditions at beginning of late gestation and through lactation is dependent on how we manage them while they're dry and open during flushing, breeding, and early gestation. Because you can adjust the feed a lot during the period when they're dry and open and early gestation. That's the best time to adjust your feed so that we get to the right stage in late gestation and early lactation. This is a graphic illustration of just what that table said just now. You see, the body condition scores are over there on the vertical axis, and then the periods on the horizontal. And you see that we start them out in nutritional flushing at about a 1.5. They gain weight during that in early breeding. Then in early gestation, they pretty much stay the same. Yeah, they'll gain a little bit as we go. Then we go to late gestation, and we peak here at lambing time. The highest point here is lambing, when they'd be a 3.5 or a 4. And then it drops off significantly during early lactation, 60 days. If you leave the lambs on the ewe, it's going to go down even further. And then once you wean the lambs, whatever period it is, or time it is, they're going into maintenance. So that illustrates how the ewe's body condition score changes. Basically, that says that is how her degree of fatness changes as she goes through the annual production year. Try and relate these body condition scores and this curve to the ewes that you are dealing with on an annual basis. The reason we're really concerned about the last 28 days of gestation is illustrated in this graph. This is an old graph that was published 100 years ago, almost. Okay? But the principle still applies. The numbers that I have on here, I just put these numbers on here. They may vary. They may get up to 30 pounds, or they may be less than 11 pounds on a single on here and so forth. But let's put these numbers on. The point is, we're looking for the first 60 days, the growth of unborn lamb or lambs is only about 1.5 pounds. Then it increases a little bit to 90 and a little bit to 120. Boy, 120 to 150 days, and I rounded 147 days off to up to 150. That's when business really starts. Because I did a little calculation here, and in the last 30 days of this graph, I think my calculations are correct. The single lambs, the bottom line, the single, 73% of the total weight of that 11-pound lamb was made during the last 30 days. Does that mean we need to figure out how to feed? That's going to, if that lamb's going to, that fetus is going to grow that much, or if it's a pair of twins in the top line from 9 to 20, what's that? Increase 55% or something like this in the last 30 days. That brings us to the point of how we're going to feed these ewes in late gestation successfully. Well, one thing we can do and must do is increase the quality of the feed that we're going to provide these ewes. We can't feed low quality hay successfully during late gestation because there's not enough room in her digestive tract to be able to eat all the hay that she wants to eat because the fetuses are growing so rapidly and so much, they're taking up all the space within her body. So that behooves us to change the feed a little bit, to maybe feed higher quality hay so she doesn't have to eat much, but supplement that with concentrates. These ewes can get by without any concentrate from day 0 to 120. but she needs concentrates from 120 to 150 because they're going to provide her energy. They're going to provide her energy more efficiently than the hays will or the roughages will or pasture either, okay? And that in turn will help to prevent pregnancy toxemia that might occur in a ewe that is in a body condition score that is over 4 or less than a 2. So we have to bear that in mind and make sure that we feed that ewe the right way in the last 30 days. Okay, this is an illustration of what I was talking about. You read the title, Daily Feed, TDN. TDN is total digestible nutrients. That is a measure of energy. And CP, which is crude protein or protein. So these are the requirements. These are nationally, internationally, all over the place requirements for use. That way 110, 132, 154, 176, 198, one of those. When she's dry and open, and she has a body condition score in the beginning of late gestation at 2.5 to 3. And she's going to have twins. I used 154 pound ewe throughout this talk tonight. So we look down at 154 pounds. She needs to gain basically a half a pound per head per day during the last 30 days. To do that, she'll need to eat 4.7 pounds of feed. I know that's 4.7. Who cares about that? It's 4.5, 4 3/4, 5. 4.7 is her requirement. She will also need, in that, she will need 2.8 pounds of total digestible nutrients and 0.47 pounds of crude protein. Yeah, we do all these calculations, and not everybody's going to do it that way. But the point I would also make that ration for the 154 pound ewe contains 60% TDN and 10% crude protein. 60% TDN, 10% crude protein. So what does she need most during late gestation? Energy or protein? She needs energy. And where does she get the energy? From the concentrates. And I'll go a step further, that the classic for us in this area is shell corn. Look at the footnotes down below. If your ewes happen to be greater, have a BCS greater than 3.0, cut her feed back a little bit so that she's fed at 132 pound weight. Okay? Or if she's a little on the skinny side, when she starts late gestation and she's less than a 2.5, feed her like she was 176 pound ago. Because we've got to get her at the right body score at lambing time so that she can milk to her maximum during lactation. And she'll need to have the right amount of condition on her to be able to do this. Okay? So, a little bit here on the management aspects. We're going to enter late gestation. That's the last 28 days or 30 days, whatever. So she enters at a BCS at 3. We should also check her for MASHA, check about worms, and as I say, check her body condition score. Need to plan to vaccinate for enterotoxemia type C and D, along with tetanus. Then, just from experience, we begin to feed grain while the ewes are outside. We feed one time a day during that 28 days, or at least 21 days of that while they're still outside, rather than bringing them to the barn. We only feed once a day. We might feed half a pound, or we might feed a pound. Again, that might depend on the condition score of the ewes that we're feeding. Assuming that they're out there on pasture, or we might be feeding hay, or they may even be on turnips during this late gestation period. Still, we're going to need to feed some grain, some energy. To feed the energy as in the form of grain this last 28 days. So they'll get the body condition score that's ideal, and that will cut down on the chances of them running into pregnancy, toxemia, or ketosis. So we typically will move our ewes to the barn a week before lambing. Sometimes they slip up on us and may lamb out in the pasture before we get them into the barn. That's not really ideal. But we talked about close-up pens, or up-close pens last week. So we're going to move them to those up-close pens. And that's where they're going to lamb, in the up-close pens. You may want to separate them into those that are really heavily pregnant that are going to lamb first, up closer to where your lambing pens are going to be, or your jugs, and put the others further away, and then you'll move them as they lamb from one pen to another. Always remember to have mineral available in loose form, available, free choice, and water. Water is really important with these ewes. It is important for the fetus development, and it is really, really important once they use lamb because of the milk that she's going to have to give. So again, her average daily gain ought to be a half a pound per head per day for the last 28 days, so that we get her up to a body condition score at lambing at 3.5 to 4. I had a whole bunch of rations on here. And the reason I've got so many is because everybody's situation is different. This is an 8 example rations for a 154-pound ewe when she's 3.0 body condition score. She's in the late gestation. Okay. Alfalfa hay, shell corn is a classic. Clover hay and shell corn can do the same. But clover hay is, you don't see a lot of it if it's not mixed with grass. And that's the next one, number 3. Grass legume hay with shell corn. However, in that third one, look what we had to do. We had to add some soybean meal in order to get the protein where it should be for 154-pound ewe. The reason for that is that the grass that's mixed with the legume diluted the protein so much that we had to compensate for that with a little dab of soybean meal. The other one with the grass legume hay is number 4. You may want to feed oats. So you have to feed more oats than you do shell corn to get the same performance, because oats have a lower feeding value than this corn. Plus, most times they're a lot more expensive for the feeding value. So that means I go back for us in this area, especially shell corn is the classic concentrate. Ration number 5, you see, it's only got 2 pounds of alfalfa hay, and it's got soybean hulls. A lot of people want to feed soybean hulls. These soy hulls are okay. They're highly digestible, and sometimes they're fairly cheap to buy compared with some other feedstuffs. They are fairly digestible, as I say, and they provide significant energy and some protein. Some. For example, if we wanted to feed all soy hulls, which we probably wouldn't do, then we would be short on protein. So we'd have to add protein either as soybean meal or alfalfa hay. And that's exactly what I did in this number 5 ration. Then we come to fescue orchard grass hay. Footnotes C and D. C is orchard grass, OG, and D is mature. Okay, that's mature hay. And what did we say about feeding mature or low quality hay to the gestating ewe a while ago? She doesn't have room to handle it all, and it doesn't provide enough energy. It's not as digestible, so it doesn't provide enough energy, so we really have to supplement her. And here we come more with shell corn and add the soybean meal. Number 7 is orchard grass hay and 1.5 pounds of shell corn. So what happened here? That orchard grass hay is in vegetative state. Okay, C and E. It is in vegetative state versus the mature on the fescue orchard grass hay. So that means it's a higher quality hay, so you don't have to feed as much. I promise you, based on the experiences I've had, getting ewes to eat more than 3 pounds of hay per head per day is a pretty tough job, especially if they're carrying multiple fetuses. So you see, I don't have any 4 or 5 pounds on here because we tried. We tried at the UK sheep unit, and we can't do it. Sometimes even go down to 2 to 2.5 pounds of hay per head per day. But we keep the grain up in that case, so that they'll have adequate energy to continue to gain weight and get to an ideal body condition score. Then the last one over ration 8 is alfalfa hay with barley. I just substituted barley in for shell corn. However, I think that would be too expensive based on where we're located. Trying to buy barley would be a little bit more expensive, I think. So those are some example rations. Again, as I said before, think of your own situation and the feedstuffs that you have fed, want to feed, would like to feed, and so forth. Think about these rations and how to try to put them together. You may have altogether different feedstuffs than I've got here, but try to use this as a base to develop your own. Now then, I talked about 154-pound ewe, okay? 154. So some of your ewes may weigh more or they may weigh less than 154 pounds. When they're dry and open, when they're at maintenance, not when they're getting ready to have a lamb. No. Oh, all of this is based on that ewe's weight. When she's dry and open, she's loafing. Okay? So if they're heavier, 176 or 198, I tried to calculate this out, and it would be about 5% more for 176 and 10% more feed. That doesn't mean you feed 10% more hay and leave the grain like it was. No, you got to equally, okay, with the hay or the roughage and the concentrate. The same thing applies if the ewes weigh less. They weigh 132 pounds or 110. When they're dry and open, then you're going to feed that much less. I have a little video of feeding grain to ewes that are pregnant, or if they're lactating, same principle applies. I don't have any video of feeding hay. I suspect everybody knows how to feed hay. Then on the other end of this video is feeding silage. I know that most of you will not have silage to be fed, but I talked to a fella yesterday from Indiana that has access to some corn silage. So it's excellent feed for lactating and for especially for gestating ewes. So to see how we do it, to illustrate one thing here we illustrate is that we weigh all the feed that we provide to these ewes, regardless of whether it's silage, whether it's hay, whether it's a grain.
So today we're going to show you a video focusing solely on feeding grain to the lactating ewes. So as we showed before, once the ewes come out of the lambing pens, they go back into bigger pens. We call those just the mixing pens. And so when they once they're in the lambing pens, we'll work them up to 1.5 pounds of grain per day, and we'll kick them out into these mixing pens. And we'll keep them at 1.5 pounds of grain per head per day until we get a pen full. Usually in these pens, we'll put 14, sometimes 15, depending on how many ewes we have in a pen. So once we hit that mark where the pen's full, we're not going to put any more ewes and lambs in there. Then we're going to slowly start working them up by 1/4 pound increments. So after the pen's full at 1.5 pounds per head per day, then we'll bump them to 1.75, and we will leave them there for a few days, and then we'll bump them again. So we'll go 1/4 pound increments, and these ewes, depending on their age and how their condition persists, they'll be at 2.25, usually 2.5 pounds of grain per head per day throughout the time that they're lactating with these lambs. And that is coupled with the dry matter of the either hay or in the near future will be a TMR mix of corn silage, haylage, and alfalfa hay. So in the near future we will show you a video feeding the TMR mix, but that's the gist of how we feed the lactating ewes and how much they're going to get fed as far as the grain goes. So here at the farm, during the winter, we feed out of 2 silos. So we have one silo that is full of corn silage, and we have one silo that is full of alfalfa haylage. So this year we've already opened them up. You have to get the top layer. It's kind of the crust. So once you fill the silos, everything is very moist, and then it kind of crusts off the top, which seals everything underneath of that allows the corn silage or the haylage to ferment and all the bugs to do the work to get it to where it's in an edible form. And so you have to run the top crust layer off before you get down to the good stuff that's edible for the sheep. So we're going to show you today how we fill the wagons. So we have a TMR wagon we hooked to our tractor, and so this wagon just sits on 4 load cells, and then we have a scale head in the tractor, and we're able to know exactly how much of each ingredient we're putting in this wagon so that we can ensure that the ewes are getting the nutrition that we want based on the amount of ingredients. So the way we do the mixture here is we do a 40-40-20. So we'll do 40% corn silage, 40% alfalfa haylage, and then 20% of just the dry alfalfa hay. So from each silo we have a conveyor that then runs the silage up and into the wagon for us. So I'll go ahead and start the silo and the conveyor and show you all how that works. So we just have buttons over here. So we'll just turn the conveyor on first. And then over here we have our control box for our silo. So we have a safety switch here. You just have to twist that button, and then the box is active. You'll hit the start button, and you'll see this dial here shows us the amps that the unloader inside of the silo is running. And that way we know, we can simply watch this dial and how it's acting, and we can determine what's going on with the unloader on the inside. And so as you can see, there's oil solids running out. We're not going to run it too hard today because we're going to try and get a whole layer off of the silo. So where it's not real cold and we don't feed a whole lot of silage here at this time of year, you want to try and at least get the top layer off of that silo every day to keep it fresh. Because if you were to leave stuff sitting on top for too long, it's going to spoil. It's just not going to be as edible for the sheep. So now we're going to go ahead and run the alfalfa haylage out. It's the same deal as the corn silage. Come over here, turn the conveyor on. Take the safety switch off. We'll start the unloader. Watch our amps. Came back down to about 10, 12 amps. See the haylage running out. So these silos, as you can see back here, you see the white chute. It runs all the way to the top of the silo. So we call it an unloader on the inside of the silo. It's basically a big ring that's supported by 3 winches, and you can see right out this window these metal wires are what control the winch, and that's what's going to lower and raise our unloader on the inside of the silo. So it's a big ring with an auger that's attached to it, and the auger just rotates around the silo. There's double augers, and they just move around the silo, pulling the silage or the haylage in to the middle, where there are big metal flappers that then take the silage and throw it on an arch that shoots it over into through the doorway, and it comes down the chute that we showed you earlier, which then comes out the spout and up the auger into the wagon. It sounds a lot more complicated. It's simpler if you can see it, but that's the best that I can do, just explaining it on the outside of the silo. So now we're going to add the dry alfalfa hay to the wagon. So as you can see on the wagon, there's this slanted piece of metal, and that is made so that when we throw the big flakes of alfalfa hay, we throw them, it hits that, and it's going to slide down. And this auger up here on top has knives, and that's to help chop up the hay, because we want the hay chopped up really fine. We don't want long stems of hay in the TMR, so the knives on the augers are going to help chop that up and make it finer to help mix it with the silage and the haylage. This is definitely the messiest part of loading the wagon. We try to keep as much of the leaf from the hay going into the wagon as we can. So now you can see we've got the wagon loaded with all 3 ingredients, and you can see all the augers. There's multiple augers. There's 2 smaller ones here close to us, top one being the one with the blades on it to help chop up the hay, and then there's a much larger auger that you can't really see that's on the other side, and that helps to keep everything mixed up. It's got bigger paddles on it to help churn everything and push it over to the smaller augers, which will then help to feed it out of the wagon. But we'll show you how the wagon works and how we feed out of it next. So now you can see us in the barn with the TMR wagon. We're feeding the ewes. So as you can see, the augers are going to turn that TMR out onto the chute. And then there are smaller augers in the chute that are going to work that TMR mix out into our concrete feed bunks. See, as we're feeding, so right now these ewes had been on 5 pounds of alfalfa dry hay per head per day on top of their grain. So now that we're switching them over to the TMR mix of the 40-40-20 with the corn silage, alfalfa haylage, and the dry alfalfa hay, we started them at 8 pounds per head. That should be enough for these girls. We will monitor their intakes from here and adjust accordingly. If they're not cleaning it up, we might have to back them down a little bit until they get more adjusted. And if they're cleaning it up quicker than we would like, then we will also have to up them. Just make sure that they're getting the nutrients that they need. It's very important during lactation to get these lambs growing, get them big as quick as possible. So as you can see in the feed bunk, you see how mixed up this is. It looks pretty good. The hay's ground up pretty fine, mixes right in with the corn silage and the alfalfa haylage. And so with that wagon, once we get all the ingredients in it, we're usually going to mix close to 10 minutes, and that's due to the hay. We want to give the hay ample time to mix within the silage and haylage and to get chopped up to make it more fine. So we currently just have the 4 pens of lactating ewes. Alright, so now that you all have seen the process from the outside, how we feed the ewes, we thought we'd give you a look inside the tractor. So this is our scale head here that is connected to the load cells on the wagon, like I previously talked about. And so then we have just a little bubble over here, and that's where we keep track of how much TMR is going to go to each pen, and we monitor that daily and make changes as needed. And then once we finish feeding and when we reload the tractor for the next day, we know exactly how much of each ingredient is going to be needed the next day. But this scale head, once we get to a pen, so if we get to pen 3, and I know they need 120 pounds of TMR, all I have to do is I'll go over here, I'll hit the load button, I can hit 120, and I'll hit unload. And then from there, all I got to do is feed out the TMR, and it's going to count down for me. And then once it gets close to 0, this red light's going to flash. I know I'm close. I can feed it out. Once I hit 0, I know that that pen has gotten exactly 120 pounds. So that way we're able to be accurate when we're feeding and know that each ewe is getting the appropriate amount of TMR daily. Which again, nutrition is very important in this stage with the lambs and the ewes. So that is the whole rundown of how the silage and haylage gets from the silo all the way to the ewe.
Jumped the gun just a little bit, but the point is, we do feed silage, and this video was made for my sheep class, as it said, last fall when we lambed. We had 74 ewes that lambed last fall. So we feed silage in the wintertime to the gestating ewes when they're in the barn. The same deal as we talked about here. We would feed 5 pounds of that silage or so to these ewes, all basically, about now, and that's equal to about 2.5 to 3 pounds of hay on a dry matter basis, and then we supplement it with a grain mix, as you saw in the bunks there. So in the winter, for sure, we feed the silage. You can do the same thing with the hay, because the hay that you're feeding to your ewes in late gestation, the amount that you're feeding, and the grain that you're feeding, then they have lambs, and they go through the lambing barn or lambing facility or the jugs. Then they go off feed a little bit. Then you got to bring them back up to the lactating ration. So you increase your hay and increase your concentrate as you go into the lactating ration. So the ewes are in the upmost pen. They lamb there. Then they bond and move the lambs to the jugs. We process the lambs. That means that we're going to weigh, record the information, iodine the navel, remove the mucal plug from the teats, put them in the lambing jugs, and provide plenty of water for the ewe in the first 24 hours. After they're in the lambing jugs, we're going to check the ewes and lambs every 2 hours. We will provide 3 to 5 pounds of grass hay per ewe per day while they're in the jugs. And then they might receive 1/2 to 1 pound of corn or a grain mix per ewe per day while they're in the jugs. Because that I say may, because they may stay in there only 24 hours, or they may stay in there a couple of days, or up to 5 or 6 days, depending on how the ewe's getting along, giving milk, whether she's taking the lamb, and how healthy the lamb is. Once we're satisfied with that, they're ready to go back to the mixing or maternity pen. Then we'll dock, castrate, ear tag, and vaccinate the lambs as they go back.
So today we thought we'd do a short video and show you how we feed through the whole barn. We're actually right in the middle of fall lambing, so we're going to kind of show you how all that works. First, we're going to feed the lambing pens where we have the ewes with the newborn lambs. So you can see Andre, he's going to clean out the feeder. You always want to make sure you get any leftover debris from the previous day out of the feeders so that you're not making the ewes pick through that debris to eat their grain the next morning. And right now, when you have ewes, these polypays have a lot of twins and sometimes triplets, but as long as they have twins, we will normally start feeding them about 1 pound the day after they lamb. So the day they lamb, when we bring them in these pens, we won't feed them very much, maybe a little hay that afternoon, because we want them to be focusing on their lambs and taking care of them instead of messing with the feed. And as long as they're milking the way we want, then the girls with twins will usually get 1 pound of grain that day, and will then be bumped up from there. But if they just have a single and they're milking well, we'll probably just give them some hay that first day, and we'll wait until they go back out to the mixing pens before they'll get any grain again. So you can see he's over there checking on the lambs. That's another important part of feeding these lambing pens. You want to make sure all the lambs get up. You want to make sure they look lively. A couple of things we really like to look for is if a lamb is laying down and you get him up, you like to see him get up and stretch. That's usually a good sign that he's a healthy, happy lamb. You like to see them with their ears perky and just look lively is the main thing. Make sure that their belly's full. You can see he's feeding with that blue scoop, and that's just an easy way for us to measure the feed. That blue scoop full is exactly 1 pound of our grain mix, so that makes it easy for us to feed these lambing pens and know exactly how much these sheep are getting without having to go back to the scale in the feed room and weigh out the feed for each lamb. Now you see he's got it's actually our cattle show stick, but it works good for getting these lambs up, making sure that they're good to go, and to prevent us from having to go in each pen if they're laying in the back. Just give them a little nudge, and as long as they hop right up like those 2 lambs did, then you know they're doing pretty well. So here in the lambing pens, we keep small squares, and we have 2 types of hay. Predominantly we'll use this orchard grass hay. It's a good soft, it's a high quality grass hay, and most of the ewes will get that, but we also keep some pure alfalfa around, and that's if we have a ewe that's not milking very well, we'll feed her the alfalfa, and that's really going to help with the lactation. It's going to give her the added nutrition to start producing more milk. You can see Andre is now going through feeding the ewes hay. Usually get about a flake once in the morning, and then as long as they're going to stay in that pen, they'll get another flake in the afternoon before we leave. You can see he's just giving all these ewes the orchard grass hay because all these girls have been producing milk like we want, so we're just going to stick to the grass hay, and we're able to give them a pretty good amount of the grass hay, and that kind of keeps them full and quiet and happy throughout the day.
So the ewes are ready to leave. Ewes and lambs are ready to leave the jug. We would recommend deworming either when they're leaving the jug or certainly within 10 to 14 days after lambing. That is to control the paraparturient rise in the stomach worms that inhabit the digestive tract of all these ewes. And we think it's maybe best to do it as you leave the jug, because if you put them in ewes and lambs in a mixing pen, and you got the baby lambs in there that's a week, 10 days, or 2 weeks old, then you try to get them up and separate the lambs from the ewes. There's liable to be a ewe that'll step on a lamb and break a leg or something like this. So deworming as they leave the jug is an advantage, because you won't run into a problem like that. So the ewes leave lactation at weaning at a body condition score of 1.5. Even though we fed them all this silage, we fed them all the grain, all the hay, whatever, that's okay. If they're really giving their heart, soul, and body to the lambs, then they will be at a 1.5 to 2 by the time they leave lactation. And remember, they started lactation when they were 3.5 or 4. So this third step that I've got, third item that I've got on this slide is highly important. You feed for milk, not for BCS, not for body condition score. Yeah, we like for ewes to always look good. Yeah, and that's an old shepherding deal. Man, that's a good looking set of ewes or something like this, you know. Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, you want to feed for milk so that the lambs will go to their maximum. Always remember mineral and water. Now, recognize this table? Anyone? We spent a whole bunch of time talking about this. So now we're down here in early lactation. She lambs at 3.5 to 4, and we feed her till her eyeballs pop out, and she leaves lactation at 60 days at a 1.5 or 2. Let me say this at this time. If you feed low quality rations, I'm afraid we're going to expect low quality performance. Feed high quality rations, hopefully we'll get high quality performance depending on the genetics of the sheep. So I would encourage you to think about this and try to feed the quality rations that you need to feed in each one of these stages. This is the same kind of table that I showed you before for late gestation. I'm using 154-pound ewe. Look what she does as far as gain or loss of weight is concerned. You can feed her and feed her and feed her, and she will still lose weight and body condition while she's lactating if she's really good, if she's good. And to keep that weight loss at this low level, or a little better, for a 154-pound ewe, she's going to need almost 7 pounds of dry matter feed, 7 pounds of feed. And that is 4 pounds of TDN, of energy, and 0.92 pounds of crude protein. That ration, reading across on a 154-pound ewe, analyzes about 58% TDN versus the 60% TDN that we were feeding for the lactating ewe, because we had to feed her a lot of extra grain. But the crude protein here in this ration is 13% versus the 10% that we saw in the late gestation ration. So there is a difference. There is a difference here as far as what nutrients are going to we're emphasizing with our ration. These are the example rations, 8 more for lactating ewes. The classic one is 5 pounds of alfalfa hay and 1.9 to 2 pounds of shell corn. Instead of feeding all that fancy silage that we talked about, feed her 5 pounds of alfalfa hay and 2 pounds, 1.9 to 2 pounds of shell corn. Depending on some of these. Sometimes our ewes, and some of our ewes are bigger than the 154 pounds. Sometimes we'll get them up, as Matt said in the video, 2 to 2.5 pounds while they're lactating. We want them to stay in as good a condition as we can, but at the same time, we also know that they're supposed to lose weight, even though we're feeding them really good. We could do, again, we could pretty much do the same thing with the clover hay, although we have to add, in this case, add 2/10 of soybean meal. That becomes expensive, doesn't it, when we have to feed the soybean meal. Then grass legume hay, 5 pounds. Notice I'm locked in pretty much on 4 to 5 pounds of hay. I'm pretty much locked in. 1.5 to 2 pounds or so of concentrate, that being the grain. So we're on ration 3 with 5 pounds of grass legume hay, 1.7 of shell corn, and 1/2 pound of soybean meal. You can read across here the same principles that I described as far as the late gestation rations were concerned. We can feed oats Same principle applies as we said with the late gestation. You see that we have to supplement there with 4/10 of a pound of soybean meal. In the alfalfa hay, we had 2 pounds of alfalfa hay and 3 pounds of soy hulls in the late gestation ration, but this time we're going with 4 pounds of alfalfa and 3 pounds of soy hulls. That means they need more protein, and we're providing it through the alfalfa hay. Feed that fescue orchard grass hay that is pure, 4.5 pounds, 2 pounds of shell corn, 6/10 pounds of soybean meal on a cross. Think about these in relation to the rations that you can feed to your ewes. Okay? These are not necessarily the gospel, they're just examples. Same kind of slide that I showed you for late gestation. If your ewes weigh more than 154 pounds, as I said, you can increase it equally. Your roughage and your concentrate, same way on the 198-pound ewes. If they weigh less, you can cut them back some. Because if you continue to feed them that way of a 154-pound ewe, they're liable to pick up weight while they're lactating. They're using that feed to put condition on their body instead of converting it into milk for the lambs. I really like this system. Ewes and lambs on small grain pasture. If anybody's got any of that, of course today it'd be a little trouble finding anything for them to graze on. But a lot of times we can use small grain pasture. Rye, wheat being the primary one. If you have it, go for it. In that case, if they had adequate amount of this, then you would want to supplement with a pound of orchard grass hay and a pound of corn or grain mix. That's good. That should be their ration right there. If you're in an area where you can put winter wheat in the fall and get winter wheat pasture, then you can certainly use this ration to an advantage. If you can't do that, you may be able to plan ahead in the summer and fall and stockpile some cool season grasses and have them out on pasture. Pound the alfalfa hay instead of orchard grass hay, because the cool season grasses will be lower in protein than the small grain pasture. But still, they have to have a pound of corn or grain mix. I really would have another one, I guess. I've seen this so many times and people are still doing it, is that they'll run outside, depending on the weather, out of a barn that has access to a pasture. There may not be anything in that pasture. It may be down to the ground. But those old ewes might fiddle around and graze a little bit, find some while they're out there. They'll exercise as well, along with the lambs out there. Then bring them into the barn at night. Bring them into the barn each night. And in that case, you can have your barn, you can feed 5 pounds of hay, 4 pounds of hay, 1 to 2 pounds of grain. Turn them back out the next morning. Bring them back in that night. Really a slick method of raising these lambs, especially for those in the wintertime. Don't ever forget mineral and water. Finally, I got you to the summary. 3 lambing seasons. You saw the videos in the fall of the year. Many of you are going to be lambing in April, I'm sure. And some of you have already lambed and are lambing currently. So we got 3 lambing seasons: January, February, April, September, October. We talked about body condition scores. We could close our eyes and think what those body condition scores should be, I think. The nutrient requirements, so that we need to feed according to the nutrient requirements and based on how much these ewes weigh. We'd encourage you to think about a scale, feed scale and or a sheep scale. We talked about example rations. I tried to give you a bunch of these. It is really difficult to beat for a gestating ewe ration, 3 pounds of hay, either orchard grass or alfalfa, and a pound or so of corn or grain mix. And for lactation, 5 pounds of hay, alfalfa hay, 5 pounds of alfalfa hay, and 1.9 to 2 pounds or 2.5 pounds of grain or grain mix. So the late gestation rations contain about 60% roughage, 40% concentrates. Again, we feed more concentrates in late gestation to prevent pregnancy toxemia or ketosis. Then we go a little bit more towards roughage in the lactating rations. Feed these girls in the lactation all they can handle. So feed the ewes in late gestation according to weight and body condition score. We're trying to get to an ideal body condition score at lambing time. Then in lactation, feed them according to their weight and the number of lambs that they're missing. We're assuming they're all going to have twins, so we'll feed them according to that. I think that's all I've got. I guess I would entertain any questions. Saw some of them come up on the chat box. Kelly will help us see what those are, please.
How would rations change on total confinement inside a pack barn?
I think in that situation, you can still feed the hay and the grain. You might want to make that into a complete mixed ration. That means you would have to process your hay, and that increases the expense. Boy, that's the time when the silage, if you had corn silage, would really be good. Of course, using the silage is all dependent on how many sheep you've got. I fully understand that, and so I think it could be the same thing. Maybe what you're thinking is that if the hay that they don't eat, then it's going to pose a problem for you as far as cleaning the barn and so forth is concerned. But if you would feed the high quality hay, and I think you would have to for sure do that in confinement, your waste is going to be very limited. Hope that answers the question okay.
What about feeding just silage and dry alfalfa hay TMR mix in the future? Should I add whole corn?
Okay. All right. Yes. Alfalfa, corn silage, and whole corn. The only reason you need to process your corn for the ewes is if you're going to mix something else with it. If you're feeding corn like we were out of a bucket in here by itself, you see, that's fine. You don't have to have a fancy grain mix to feed that. But when you feed alfalfa, it better be high quality. So corn silage provides a very minimum amount of protein. Corn provides a very minimum amount of protein. So alfalfa has got to provide basically all the protein in that mix. But that's good. That's good because the silage is the cheapest feed that you can provide for your ewes.
All right. What wormer do you use?
You could use Sidectin. You can use Tramasol. We use a copper sulfate mix. All of our ewes out of the lambing pen. And we typically will wait until the lambs are about 10 to 14 days of age. Granted, I said they might get run over and they could get stepped on and this sort of thing. But we believe that using the copper sulfate that we use, we're better off if we wait 10 days or so after she has a lamb. But we do use a copper sulfate mix. That copper sulfate mix is old time. We have to use it because our sheep are, no, I'd say it this way. The worms in our sheep are all resistant to all the dewormers that are commercially available. We have proof of that. So if we want to control, and we learned this about 13 years ago, if we want to control stomach worms, we had to go to something else besides the commercial deworming. And I've got a few years on me. And when I was in undergraduate, I took a sheep class and I learned about copper sulfate as a dewormer. So when we ran into a problem 13 years ago, I got my textbook out and found that formula, and we've been using that ever since. Because our worms were resistant to cydectin, tramasol, and the other wormers we have. But if yours are not, these should work for you.
On late gestation ration 6, can you feed hay freely and then feed corn and soybean meal as required per the ration?
The problem you have, and I should preface this and say, I don't know what quality of hay that you're feeding. If it is low quality, she can't eat enough. See, it's confounded because hay takes up so much of the digestive tract, and that cuts her. She doesn't have much appetite. Plus, the lambs are growing so much it's squeezing the digestive tract, so she's not hungry, so she may not eat it. So then you've got to come back in with something else. She needs the roughage, so you need a higher quality roughage. With regard to the corn and soybean meal, yes, if your hay is low quality, then you're going to need to have some soybean meal in with your shell corn. Point I make here is if you add soybean meal with shell corn, I think you have to limit that very much. Mix it as best you can and keep the soybean meal from falling to the bottom of a sack or a tub or whatever you mix it in. So you need to feed grains that are of the same physical form. You need to feed the concentrates that are of the same physical form. Soybean meal pellets would probably work better with pure shell corn, whereas ground shell corn works good with soybean meal. Cracked corn is kind of in between. If I was feeding cracked corn, I would go to the pellets.
Have you ever fed brassicas to lactating ewes, and if so, has there been any issues with it?
Brassicas work best for gestating ewes. The reason being is, and it's early gestating ewes, is because they're really low in protein and they're full of water, and so they have to eat a lot to get the nutrients they need. So we feed them routinely. We graze them routinely in the fall of the year with gestating ewes. Early gestation. We graze them as much as we can. I've known people who've that around Lexington who have grazed turnips, brassicas, all the way through the 1st of January. They worked really well in that case, but they weren't lambing in January. So they work well in that case, as long as they don't have a severely hard freeze. if they get a hard freeze on the brassicas, then they seem to get a little mushy, and they're not very palatable. The sheep like them really hard and crisp. But I think if you were grazing ewes on brassicas with lambs, if you did it in the fall, it might work. But you also must supplement. I would have some hay available, and I would supplement with concentrates depending on what stage of production the ewes are in. The reason I would use some hay is to slow down the rate of passage of the brassicas that are really high in water. Feeding some hay, if you can get the sheep to eat some of the hay, then that will slow down, and then they can pull out the nutrients that are in those washy tubers of the brassicas. They're ready made for early gestation, basically. But if you've tried them with and you use them with ewes and lambs and you believe it's working, I'm for not trying to fix it.
How do you feel about wheatlage?
Yes, like wheat pasture, it is an extension of the wheat pasture, and the wheatlage is outstanding, like corn silage is. It is high in protein. It is high in water. If you feed the wheatlage, then you probably need to think about feeding hay again to slow down the rate of passage. This might be the same case if you fed only corn silage, because it's 65% water and 35% dry, versus hay that's 90% dry and 10% water. So wheatlage is good feed, yes, but you must supplement it.
What about Timothy hay? Is that good or bad?
It's like orchard grass and bluegrass and fescue and brome. It fits in the same. It's all the same. And the quality of all those hays, the feeding value of all those hays is totally dependent on when you put the hay up, when you bale it. If it is mature, they're all low quality. If it's headed out, they're all lower quality.
Okay, last week you talked about your protein pellet. How does that figure into your mixture?
The protein pellet is 40% protein. We mix it with the corn. 80% corn, 20% protein pellet. The corn is cracked. It may have some whole grains in it. It's a rough crack. It's not pure crack. It's kind of like running shell corn through a hammer mill without a screen. Okay? It just bangs it around and breaks it up a little bit. But 20% protein pellet, 80% cracked corn. That provides a little extra. We know that we overfeed protein when we feed this compared with feeding just shell corn. Shell corn contains 9% protein. Our pellet contains about 14%. But we have to do this because we feed that mixture of 80% cracked corn, 20% protein pellet to all the sheep on our place. Lambs, rams, ewes, replacement stock, and so forth. The lambs need it. The ewes may not need it, see. So we're overfeeding the ewes, but we're meeting the requirements for the lambs. Follow what I'm saying? So we give and take a little bit from that standpoint.
could silage be replaced with either winter wheat baleage or black oat baleage in total confinement, if easier accessible with dry grain supplement to obtain the same goal? Same goal as your silage mix.
I don't believe it can be replaced pound for pound because the silage is really a high quality feed with regard to what it's used for and the nutrients that it provides. I'm assuming that all the baleage it does not have any mold anywhere. I'm assuming that, in contrast, we know that we get mold on top of the silage in upright silos and others as well. So we have to take that mold off. If there's any chance that there's any mold, be really, really careful, because the sheep is really susceptible to listeriosis, circling disease, from moldy feeds. Any moldy feeds, not just baleage or silage, could be anywhere. So be really, really careful there. I guess that if it's high quality, I guess it could be close to a replacement to corn silage. Corn silage provides more energy and less protein. The baleage might provide a little less energy, but a little bit more protein. So it may be a trade-off from that standpoint.
All right, we got our Ramblay guy here. He's hoping to rebreed his ewes 60 days after they lamb, just as done in dairy cattle. How does he need to feed those, and should he use cedars? And then also on his dry off program to dry his ewes off, should he use tomorrow and treat sealer?
The Ramblay ewe should exhibit estrus 12 months out of the year, except when she's pregnant and lactating. So, whenever you wean those lambs, she theoretically should be able to be mated again and have another lamb sometime later. So, she should be in a condition score of 1.5 or 2. This is just right. You can flush her. I would dry her off, and I'd wait 2 to 4 weeks so that she could stop her milk production in her udder involute. Then, in the meantime, you might be able to nutritionally flush her for a couple of weeks. If you had a vasectomized ram or a teaser ram, you could put him in at the same time. If you wanted to use cedars, you could do that and synchronize estrus. So I guess what I'm saying is, yes, I think it can be done. Yes. I don't know whether you really need to go to the expense of using cedars or not, but you might give it a shot. What was the other part of the question? I lost that, Kelly.
If he uses tomorrow to help dry those ewes up, would he still need to wait the full 2 to 4 weeks before he can start flushing them again?
No, I don't believe so. I believe theoretically they should rebreed. Maybe not within 2 weeks, but certainly I think within 3 weeks to a month they should have an estrus cycle. Yeah, and it wouldn't hurt these ewes. It wouldn't hurt them to go ahead and start right after you dry them off to go ahead and nutritionally flush them. And your flushing period might be a little longer than 2 weeks, but if you're gonna have them lamb that often, you need to get them back in shape pretty quick, because they'll be too run down by the time you're trying to get 2 lamb crops in a year or something like this. So you might need to feed them. You got to feed them a little extra to get that done. Good idea.
Is shell cracked corn the best grain to go with a protein tub and wheat or Sudan haylage? Or what is better suited for lactating ewes?
I think shell corn, because again, if you're going to process these grains, the reason you want to process it is if you're going to mix something with it of the same physical form. If you're not mixing anything with this grain, then I'd feed shell corn, unprocessed.
If you missed the CD&T prior to lambing a ewe, is there a problem giving any after lambing to cover the lambs up to 30 days?
Give it to baby lamb as he's born, shortly thereafter, because the type C is the enterotoxemia that will affect the baby lamb. The type D is the one that will affect the ewe and the older lambs. So if you didn't give it to the ewe, go ahead and give it to the baby lamb. I would also plan to vaccinate that same lamb at 5, 8, and 11 weeks of age with CDT, or just CD.
All right, what do you think about adding molasses to the feed mix?
If you want to encourage the intake, you could add molasses. If you want to cut the dust, some feed stuff, you can add molasses. It's like feeding candy. They love it. But you got to remember that wet molasses is about 60% dry matter, 40% water. It's really high in water. So if you buy molasses, you pay a lot for water. The feeding value of molasses is much lower by itself than the grains. Your best buy is with the grains if you're looking for an energy source. If you want to increase intake or encourage intake by of the low quality feed stuff or cut the dust to increase intake, then you could use about 5% molasses. But in that case, with the molasses, if it was hay, you'd have to grind the hay to mix the molasses with it. So there are there are more valuable feedstuffs than the molasses from a nutrient standpoint.